My name is Lily Marlowe, and I was 34 the afternoon my father was lowered into the ground outside Boise. The pastor's words were still hanging in the cold air when people started drifting toward their cars, coats pulled tight. I was standing there with a handful of damp tissues when my sister stepped in front of me and pressed a clipboard against my chest. The papers on it weren't for condolences. They were consent forms for a DNA test, printed in neat black letters, marked where she wanted me to sign. Her hand was steady, her voice even steadier. "Take it, or you get nothing." She did not look at my face when she said it. Her eyes were fixed on the line of dark sedans at the edge of the hill, on our father's estate. Land, investments, everything he had built, worth around $5 million. I should have told her no, should have asked why she would ambush me beside the raw dirt on our father's grave. Instead, I watched her fingers tighten around the pen she had uncapped. She had turned grief into leverage. She thought I would beg. I did neither. I took the clipboard, signed where she had highlighted, and handed it back without a word. The ink sank into the paper while the last mourners walked away behind us. My sister finally looked at me then, searching for some crack she could pry open. All she found was a face as blank as the winter sky. Before I tell you what he said, and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now? And where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. A few hours later, I was sitting in an office that smelled faintly like old coffee and printer toner. My sister's name is Bianca. She chose the chair closest to the attorney's desk, crossing her legs like this was another meeting she could run. Our mother, Helena, sat beside me on the opposite side of the table, hands folded around a crumpled tissue she kept turning over and over. The man behind the desk introduced himself as Peter Crane, an estate attorney in Boise who, according to the brass plaque on his wall, had been doing this for more than 20 years. He explained the basics of probate in a calm, practiced rhythm. There would be an inventory of assets, an executor, notices to creditors, filings with the court. He spoke about my father's ranch land outside the city, about retirement accounts and life insurance, about a portfolio worth roughly $5 million. His tone stayed neutral, almost bored, as if numbers like that passed over his desk every week. It felt strange to hear my father's entire life reduced to categories and line items. Bianca listened without blinking. She had a leather folder open, pen laid across the spine, posture straight. If you did not know better, you would think she was the one hiring Peter, not the daughter of the man who had just died. Every time he mentioned the property, her fingers brushed the folder like she was already balancing columns in her head, assigning value, subtracting anything that did not fit whatever plan she had. Mom barely reacted. She nodded when Peter said her name, but her gaze stayed on the tissue in her hands. The lines around her mouth looked deeper than they had that morning. I had grown up watching her smooth over every argument in our house. Now she could not seem to smooth anything. Her shoulders rounded inward, as if she were trying to fold herself smaller to avoid choosing sides. When Peter finished his overview, he opened a thinner file stamped with my father's last name. The papers inside were clipped in tidy sections. He told us my father had updated his will after a health scare a few years back, that the newer document would control what happened now. In that revision, my father had named both of his daughters as heirs, with specific instructions about the land, the house, and a charitable donation he wanted made in his name. Then Peter paused. There was, he said, an additional provision. My sister leaned forward by a fraction of an inch. I felt my jaw tighten. Mom's shoulder brushed mine and stayed there, heavier than before. Peter did not rush. He flipped to another page, reading as he went. My father had written that if any dispute arose about biological relationship, the executor was required to obtain certified DNA testing before releasing major assets. If no dispute ever came up, the clause would never matter. If someone insisted on proving something, the results would dictate how the estate was split. Bianca shifted in her chair. For the first time since we walked in, the smooth confidence around her eyes chipped. This was the mechanism she had triggered earlier without, apparently, understanding all of its edges. She asked Peter who would serve as executor. He answered that the court would almost certainly appoint him, based on the way the documents were drafted and the fact that my father had used his firm for years. Mom finally looked up long enough to ask whether any of this could be handled quietly. Peter said most estates were, but once genetic testing was involved, it became harder to keep things out of public filings. There were forms, lab reports, potential hearings. The law did not care about embarrassment. It cared about procedure. While he outlined the steps for arranging the test through a certified laboratory, I listened to the cadence of his voice more than the words. Schedule, identification, chain of custody, results forwarded to his office, and the court file. It was all procedural, inevitable, already moving. Bianca accepted the stack of forms he slid across the desk with a hand that only trembled once. Mom did not reach for anything. I signed where Peter indicated. My signature small in the white space next to lines my father had approved when he was still alive. The pen felt heavier than it should have, but I kept my grip steady. I understood now that this was not just about my sister's suspicion. It was about the rule my father had written for the day one of us tried to turn blood into leverage. By the time the weekend ended, I had a list from Peter of what he needed from my father's ranch. The drive out of town took less than 40 minutes. The house sat back from the road on a rise, a place with tired siding and a wraparound porch my father always meant to fix. His truck was gone, but everything else looked like he could have walked out the front door that morning. Peter had said someone needed to start gathering personal documents and valuables so the formal inventory would go faster. Bianca had volunteered to handle the financial side and suggested I focus on the sentimental clutter. I kept the ring of keys my father used to carry and let myself into the empty house. Inside, the air was still. I flipped on the kitchen light and saw unopened mail in a stack by the sink, a mug in the drying rack, a pair of reading glasses on the counter. I opened a cardboard box and started with the drawers. Most of what I touched had no bearing on probate. Old receipts, expired coupons, instruction manuals for appliances he had replaced years ago. I put photographs in one pile, anything that looked official in another. Peter wanted bank statements, tax returns, policy numbers. I did not know where my father kept any of that. The office was at the back of the house. There were rows of folders in the drawers, labels typed on fading tabs. I found his will there, an older version Peter had mentioned, clipped to a letter from a previous attorney. I set it aside without reading more than the date. In the bottom drawer, beneath files labeled for utilities and property taxes, there was a slim blue folder with my sister's handwriting on the tab. I hesitated before sliding it free. The papers inside were copies of emails printed in black and white. She had highlighted numbers, circled lines mentioning the estimated value of the land, scribbled notes in the margins about development, potential buyers, how much cash could be freed if the ranch was sold quickly. One thread showed messages forwarded to someone named Preston Hale, marked in her handwriting as her fiancé. There were no comments about memories or childhood summers, only projections and rough math. The folder felt more like a pitch deck than anything belonging in my father's home office. Under that blue folder sat another, a plain manila file with my father's handwriting on the tab. Peter Crane. The letters were written slowly, the way he always wrote when something mattered. The flap was secured with a metal clip. I unclasped it and tipped the file open onto the desk. On top was a short note, dated only with a month and year. My father had written that if there was ever a question about who was related to whom, Peter was to treat the attached instructions as binding. He wrote that he did not want his children turning on each other when he was no longer there to stand between them. that if anyone insisted on forcing the question, the answer should determine not only who received what, but also who would be trusted with control. Behind the note were copies of forms already signed, authorizations for DNA testing, releases to allow medical records to be used for probate purposes, and a draft letter to the court explaining why he had included the clause Peter had shown us. He had anticipated a fight and tried to arm whoever was left to finish it. In the margin of the draft letter, he had written a single line asking Peter to protect the one who does not push for this. I stacked the documents and slid them back into the file. There was nothing dramatic in what I had read, no confession, no revelation in capital letters. It was my father, methodical as ever, planning for damage he no longer trusted his family to avoid on its own. He knew his daughters well enough to sense that one of us would turn grief into an argument over numbers. When I finished with the office, I walked through the rest of the house, checking closets for anything else Peter might need. I found boxes of photographs and a shoebox full of birthday cards. I set aside anything that looked like it might have legal weight and left the rest where it was. On my way out, I locked the front door and stood for a moment on the porch, looking out over the acreage that had occupied the center of my father's life. The fences needed work. The barn roof sagged near one corner. To Bianca, it would be a spreadsheet full of potential. To me, it was a record of every year he refused to walk away. The appointment at the clinic was set for Tuesday morning. The building sat in a medical park, a low brick complex that could have held dentists or physical therapists. The sign out front said, North Valley Diagnostics. Inside, the air smelled like disinfectant. Framed prints of mountains lined the walls. A muted news channel played on an old television, and a bowl of pens with the clinic logo sat on the counter. Bianca arrived exactly on time, coat buttoned, hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. Preston walked half a step behind her with his phone in his hand, scrolling as if none of this concerned him. I signed my name on the clipboard at the front desk and handed over my driver's license when the receptionist asked. She barely glanced at it before typing into her computer. We sat in a row of chairs against the wall. Bianca took the middle seat, leaving Preston beside her and me on the end. She jiggled one foot in a small, controlled rhythm that never quite turned into a full fidget. Preston leaned back, ankle crossed over knee, surveying the room with the detached interest of someone waiting for an oil change. A woman checked in and was called back almost immediately. A young man in a hoodie watched the screen without really seeing it. My name sounded from the doorway when a nurse stepped out with a clipboard. She had a tired smile and a badge clipped to her pocket. I followed her down a hallway to a small room with a chair, a counter, and a tray of sealed swabs and tubes. She confirmed my full name and date of birth, then asked for a second piece of identification so she could document it on the form. The process was methodical. Explain why the samples had to be labeled in front of me, why signatures mattered, why the test could not be repeated casually if someone changed their mind later. I listened and nodded while she worked. When she handed me the consent form, I recognized the clinic letterhead from the papers my sister had pressed into my hands at the funeral. The swab itself took less than a minute. She gave me a sterile package, watched me swab the inside of my cheek, then sealed the tip into a tube marked with a code. She compared the code to my forms, initialed the label, and set the tube into a small rack with 2 empty slots left. When she finished, she led me back to the waiting area and called my sister's name. Bianca stood quickly, smoothing her coat, and disappeared down the hallway with the same controlled posture she took into every meeting that mattered to her. Preston glanced at me once, measuring, then went back to his phone. I looked at the closed door she had passed through and thought about my father's note in Peter Crane's file. He had not written about which daughter looked more like him or which one resembled our mother. He had written about behavior. Who would push for answers? Who would refuse to turn suspicion into a weapon unless forced? Sitting in that stiff chair under fluorescent lights, It occurred to me that the test was less about chromosomes and more about the line he had drawn between us. Bianca came back out with a thin white bandage taped to the crook of her arm. She did not look at me when she sat. Preston slipped his phone into his pocket and leaned forward to speak with her in a low voice. I could not make out the words, but I saw the way his hand tightened briefly over her knee, a small squeeze meant to steady her or steer her. It was hard to tell which. The nurse called Preston next for his own brief paperwork as a witness to the chain of custody, then returned to tell us the lab would process everything within several business days. Results would be sent to the ordering physician and to our attorney. There was nothing else for us to do. Outside, the parking lot felt sharper than the waiting room. Wind came down off the hills and cut through my coat. Bianca and Preston walked ahead of me toward their car, talking in low tones that did not carry. I unlocked my own and climbed in, fingers tight on the steering wheel. Before I started the engine, my phone buzzed with an email from Peter. He wrote that the clinic had confirmed receipt of the order and that, per my father's written instructions, he would be opening a separate packet in his file once the results arrived. It was the first time anyone had said out loud, or put in writing, that my father had left more than one kind of answer behind. The results came back the next week, and Peter asked us to meet in his conference room again. The blinds were half drawn, muting the afternoon light. Bianca sat closest to his desk with her leather folder open, pen uncapped. Preston took the chair beside her, suit jacket buttoned as if he had a role. Mom sat at the far end with a cup of water between her hands. I took the seat opposite Bianca. Peter laid an envelope on the table. The clinic had sent a report from the lab. His voice shifted into the careful cadence he used whenever he expected people to argue with the outcome. 2 coded profiles had been compared with preserved material from my father. One showed a parent-child relationship with a probability that rounded to certainty. The other showed no biological relationship at all. He identified me as the first profile. For a few seconds, nothing in the room moved. Bianca stared at the report as if there might be a second page that said something different. The color drained from her face in a wash. Her hands flattened over the folder until her knuckles blanched. Preston's posture tightened, gaze flicking from Peter to my sister and then to me. Mom made a small sound and then went still. Peter finished summarizing the lab's language for the record, then closed the report. He reminded us that my father had anticipated this possibility when he rewrote his will. The DNA clause did not exist by itself. In a sealed packet stored with the file, my father had left instructions about what should happen if testing ever confirmed that one child was not biologically his. Those instructions, Peter said, required him to treat the results as a trigger. Once a dispute forced testing and a conclusive answer came back, the estate would no longer be divided evenly. The ranch land and controlling interest in the investments would pass to the confirmed biological child. The other child would receive a smaller cash bequest and the right to choose certain personal items from the house, but no control over major assets. My father had not left room for negotiation in that structure. Bianca finally spoke. Her voice came out thin and high, asking how accurate tests like this were, whether laboratories ever mixed up samples, whether we could demand that everything be repeated. Peter answered each question with the same steady tone. The lab was accredited. The samples had been collected under strict procedure. A second test could be ordered, but the first report would still exist and would still be part of the court's record. Mom's hands were shaking now. When she began to talk, she focused on the far wall instead of on us. She said there had been a period early in her marriage when she had made a choice she regretted, that she had told my father long ago and spent years trying to make up for it. He had decided to stay and raise both girls as his own, to let the world keep believing what it already believed. He added the clause after he realized that one of us might someday try to use that old mistake as leverage. The explanation did not change the numbers. It only filled in the empty space around them. Preston stared at the table, jaw tight. Whatever calculations he and my sister had done about $5 million in land and accounts had just been erased. Peter slid 2 smaller packets across the table, one toward me and one toward Bianca. Mine outlined how the estate would proceed under the triggered clause, listing the property and accounts that would shift into my column once the court signed off. Hers described the reduced share and the process for choosing items from the ranch. Peter's voice stayed calm as he walked us through the sections that applied to each of us. Bianca did not pick up her packet. She kept her hands pressed flat on the folder, as if lifting them would make something official. When she spoke again, the controlled edge was gone. She said she would not let a test and a technicality erase a lifetime of being known as Gerald Marlowe's daughter, that there had to be a way to fight this, that no judge was going to look at her and treat her like a stranger to the man who had raised her. Peter did not try to talk her out of it. He told her she was entitled to seek her own attorney if she disagreed with the will or with his role in carrying it out. Then he folded his hands on the table and waited, the report and the packets lying between us like a boundary none of us could step back across. Within 2 weeks, Bianca had done exactly what Peter said she could. She hired her own attorney, a younger man from a downtown firm whose website promised aggressive representation. Court papers went out with my father's name in the caption and a case number stamped across the top, arguing that the DNA clause was unfair and that the will was unconscionable, that dividing an estate on biology instead of history turned years of parenting into a technicality. Copies arrived in my mailbox by certified mail with a note from Peter saying he would respond on my behalf. The petition read like a biography with the rough parts scrubbed out. It described Bianca as a devoted daughter who helped manage ranch operations, drove my father to appointments, and handled household tasks when his balance and memory slipped. It listed holidays and milestones and said neighbors knew her as Gerald Marlowe's girl. My name appeared mostly as a detail. I read the pages at my kitchen table with coffee cooling by my elbow. One paragraph mentioned me moving away for work, calls that came less often than they should have, visits that never lasted long enough. The implication was clear. She had been present, I had not. The petition framed the clause as a weapon I chose to use, not as a rule my father wrote for the day someone tried to turn suspicion into leverage. Peter's answer arrived a week later. His language was tighter, built from statutes and case citations instead of sentiment. He pointed out that my father had full capacity when he rewrote the will, that he consulted independent counsel, that the DNA provision did not erase anyone from the estate, but only shifted control if conflict erupted. He noted that Bianca herself demanded testing, that the same rule would have cut the other way if the report had landed differently. While the paperwork moved between offices, people started talking. Helena's church friends called to ask how she was holding up. A cousin left a voicemail saying he had seen our name on a public docket. One of my father's old neighbors stopped me at the grocery store and mentioned he had heard Bianca was getting a lawyer involved because there had been some kind of mistake. I watched his expression when I answered that the science was not in dispute and that the rest belonged to the court. At first, Preston stayed close to Bianca. He drove her to meetings, sat beside her in waiting rooms, and hinted that once everything settled, it would make sense to sell the ranch and put the proceeds into something more modern. When he thought I was out of earshot, he talked about timing and how rare it was to have that much land paid off. As the case stretched on, the seams in Bianca's composure began to show. She called our mother late at night demanding to know why the clause existed and insisting there had to be another version of the will hidden somewhere. Helena tried to answer without unraveling. When she hung up, she sometimes called me, asking if there was anything I could do to calm my sister. I told her there was not. The only thing that would have satisfied Bianca was a different set of numbers on the report. Fee disclosures started appearing in the file. Preston's name showed up once as someone who had paid part of an invoice for Bianca's counsel. It did not appear on the next one. When I saw them together in a courthouse hallway a month into the case, he stood half a step away from her, hands in his pockets, expression neutral. Peter kept his strategy narrow. He did not attack Bianca's character or argue that she had been less devoted. He focused on competence, intent, and the language my father signed. In his view, the question for the judge was whether to honor a clear estate plan or set it aside, because the outcome hurt more on one side of the table. When the hearing date landed on the calendar, Bianca's attorney filed one more brief full of phrases about emotional bonds and equitable relief. Reading it, I could see the shape of their closing pitch. They wanted the judge to see my sister as someone blindsided by science after a lifetime of loyalty, and to see the DNA clause as a trap my father set. A few days before we were due back in Peter's conference room, Helena mentioned that Preston had stopped picking up Bianca's calls in the evenings. Whatever he had hoped to gain from the fight no longer looked guaranteed. The ranch that had once been the center of our family's gravity was starting to feel like just another parcel waiting for a name on a deed to be confirmed in a courtroom. On the morning of the hearing, I walked into the county courthouse with a folder under my arm and my father's watch on my wrist. The probate courtroom was a narrow room with wooden benches and a raised bench for the judge. Bianca sat in the front row on the left with her attorney and a stack of files. The seat beside her was empty. Preston had decided not to come. Peter waited at counsel table on the right. Helena chose a place near the back. I sat next to Peter when he gestured me forward. When the judge entered, everyone stood. The clerk called our case. The judge read in silence for several minutes, moving through the pleadings, the lab report, and the will. Bianca's attorney spoke first. He painted her as the daughter who stayed, the one who had driven to appointments and kept the ranch running when my father's body slowed down. He called the DNA clause a punishment for an old marital mistake and argued that no fair system would strip a devoted child of control because of a lab result she never asked for. Peter answered with fewer sentences. He walked the judge through the estate planning, pointed to the medical certifications of my father's capacity, underlined that the clause did not erase Bianca from the will, but shifted control only if someone forced the question that brought us here. He noted that my sister had demanded testing, and that the same language would have favored her if the report had named me as the outsider instead. The judge asked brief questions about dates and procedures. Then he set the papers down. His ruling was short. The will met the legal requirements. The DNA report carried full weight. The clause was not hidden or ambiguous. He would not rewrite an estate because the result hurt. The petition was denied. The document my father signed would control. With one tap of his gavel, the fight became something fixed. In the hallway outside, Bianca walked past me without slowing. Her attorney matched her pace. She looked straight ahead, jaw tight. I watched her push through the glass doors and disappear into daylight. She did not look back. I did not call out. The months after that felt mechanical. The ranch went on the market with a broker who specialized in land. An out-of-state buyer made an offer close to the appraised value. When the sale closed, the proceeds moved into accounts in my name, along with the funds my father had kept in investments. Numbers appeared on a screen, big enough to change my options, small compared to what had been lost. Helena took the furniture and boxes she wanted and rented a smaller place in town. She asked me once, quietly, whether I planned to invite Bianca for dinner when things calmed down. I told her I did not. She nodded like she had been expecting that answer. The last time I heard my sister's voice was on a voicemail saying I would regret letting a piece of paper define who counted as family. I deleted it and blocked the number. I did not offer to split anything. I did not send checks or invitations. What my father left in his will became a chance to build a life that did not revolve around my sister's reaction to every decision. I kept working, paid off my own debts, and hired someone to help Helena with errands she could no longer manage alone. The ranch turned into a memory of fences in my rearview mirror and a line on a closing statement. The numbers mattered less than the lesson. Families can confuse access with love and biology with obligation. My father tried to protect the quieter child from being turned into a target. He did it with a clause instead of a speech. And I spent a year finding out whether I would live by what he wrote or by the guilt everyone else tried to hand me. In the end, I chose distance. Not revenge, not forgiveness, just distance. For my family, every time I opened the door to negotiation, someone walked through carrying leverage instead of care. Closing that door was the only way to keep from spending the rest of my life in a courtroom or a conference room. If you stayed with me to the end, thank you for listening. I hope you never have to weigh love against legal language. But if you do, remember you are allowed to draw a line and keep it. And if you made it this far, tell me where you are watching from and what part of this story stayed with you.